Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire supported by Glenlivet Books. It's extremely rare for politicians to write about their parents. It's almost exceptional for them to do so in a way that is engaging, at times heart-wrenching, often brutally candid. But that's exactly the case with two essays that were published recently in a book. And here's the book. It's called Pride, Prejudice and Punditry. And if you haven't guessed from the picture on the cover, its author is Shashi Tharoor. Joining me now to talk about his parents, Lily and Chandran Tharoor, is their son, Shashi. Shashi, as I said in that introduction, it's not often that politicians write about their parents, and your account is not just engaging, it's actually at times extremely honest. So I'm going to focus entirely on what you say about your parents and your relationship with them. And let's start with the essay on your father. You write, "He was my author, the flesh and blood source of my skills, of the spark in my eyes that I knew mirrored his own. I loved him." I get the feeling that's a euphemism. You didn't just love him, you adored him.
That's right. I did adore him. I worshipped him, and he was an amazing human being, and particularly for his generation. In all sorts of ways, he was not confined by the conventional limitations of that time. He fortunately was somebody who didn't hesitate to show his love. He didn't hesitate to act on it with his children. And he was also amazingly liberal in the freedoms he granted his children, and in particular me as his eldest son. So the result was that I think a heck of a lot of who I am and what I am and the way I behave and all of that comes from him.
You have been shaped by your father.
Very much so.
Did he spoil you?
No, in fact, he went the other way, and it was quite one of the more moving experiences of my life with him, which I have not talked about. It was many, many, many years later when we were taking a walk on Marine Drive in Bombay. He needed to walk an hour a day, and I accompanied him on this visit from whichever UN posting I was at. And I reminded him of the many, many times he had beaten the hell out of me as a kid. And tears came to his eyes as he was walking, and he said, "I'm sorry, I didn't know any better." He lost his own father when he was 10, and what he saw around him in the Kerala village where he's growing up was that corporal punishment was the way of bringing up a young boy to do the right thing. And so that's what he thought he should be doing. He'd never had either a father's love for long enough or his father's discipline, because his father wasn't there when he was turning of the age when one does become naughty.
But he showered his love on you.
He showered his love on me, and I don't think at any point that his anger either lasted very long or was meant to imply something more long-lasting than anger at some failure or transgression on my part at the time that it happened.
Now, one of the unique things about your relationship with your dad is the word games you played with each other.
Yeah.
What sort of games were they?
You know, he was just incredibly fond of words, and that's something I've inherited, as you know. And so he would, his most famous thing in Bombay, he returned from England in, what was it, 59, late 58, early 59, when he had become a Scrabble addict in the UK, and there weren't enough people other than others who had returned from England who knew what Scrabble was. He brought a set with him, and he soon set up a little group of Scrabble-playing friends who would get together every weekend and play Scrabble, though he enjoyed playing it more often than that. So out would come the board even during the week, and we kids became part of his Scrabble-playing entourage. But then he would make up his own games. And one of the things that I remember from car drives was a game he invented where he would imagine a word. He wouldn't tell you anything about the word. It had to be a 5-letter word. And the others of us in the car had to guess the word, and all he would tell us is how many letters we'd got right. So let's say, you think of the word, stick, for example, and I guess stalk. He will just have to say 3. So I know 3 of these letters are right. I don't have any idea what the others are. And
you don't know which the right ones are either.
And we don't know which the right ones are. And of 20 guesses, you're supposed to get it. And I became rather good at that thanks to his training. And then we started tricking each other by coming up with words without vowels, because swapping vowels is a very quick way you can do this. You try stick, stack, stock, and so on. Eventually, you'll realize which vowel is right, and then from the vowels you build the etc. Anyway, so then we came up with words like myths, where there was no vowel involved, and that's when he first managed to defeat me up for a long time.
Now, in the dedication to your book, Thururosaurus, you write, "To my father, Chandran Thurur, from whom I inherited my love of words." So is he responsible for the plethora of polysyllabic words that you hurl at us, almost like missiles from Valhalla?
Oh, that's so unfair of you, Karan. I think as somebody who believes in the value of communication, I really do want to be understood. So sometimes I use words that apparently are difficult for some people for effect. Sometimes I do it with my tongue firmly in my cheek, as when I wrote to the when I announced the release of my book, The Paradoxical Prime Minister, by assuring readers it was more than just a 500-page exercise in fluxi nosi nihili pilification. That was obviously meant to draw attention to the word and through the word to the book, which it succeeded in doing. So sometimes one does these things.
Sometimes it gets you into trouble like cattle class.
Except that honestly was ignorance.
But this love of words and this love of playing with them is directly inherited from your dad.
Absolutely. I mean, I should have mentioned another game that he taught us all was he would give us a rather sesquipedalian word, a sort of 8-letter, 10-letter, some 12-letter word, and then we'd be sitting down and making up words of minimum 4 letters or more from the letters in that word. Kept us occupied for hours and out of his hair. And then he would go through and he would point out other words we could have come up with.
Now, something else that he took a lot of attention in was your writing. You say in your book that he was uncritical, but doting dads usually are. But did he read everything you've written?
Yes, he passed away, I'm sorry to say, at the young age of 63 in 1993. So whatever I'd written till then, he certainly read, whether it was magazines, journal articles, newspaper articles, the Saturday Club brochure, or, by that point, my first 2 books. The Great Indian Novel, which he really liked, and Reasons of State, which was my PhD thesis rehashed. So yes, he read everything that I wrote and could. And I must say that I do miss that. I have missed since then. Oh, there was a third book. What am I saying? The $5 Smile and Other Stories, which he'd also read. But I miss the fact that my father.
But he was uncritical and admiring about anything his darling son
I remember
wrote.
there was a book party for the Great Indian Novel, and he went around telling people very proudly, "I'm the author's author." And that's where I got that expression from.
Now, the essay on your father begins with an account of his death in October 1993. You write, "For a quarter of a century, I had feared this moment. I had grown up thinking that every unexpected call at an unusual hour, every unannounced visitor was to convey the news that my father had suddenly been taken away. The fear of his loss had become so deeply entrenched that it continued to dominate me, my own heart shuddering whenever the faint hollow whine on the telephone suggested an unexpected international call." What was the cause of this fear?
He was only 38 when he had his first heart attack, and that was obviously a shock to, not least to my mother, but to all of us. I was 12 at the time, and it was something which really had us worried. He pulled through. As it turned out, it was a much worse attack, because he had a second at the age of 50 when I was working for the UN in Singapore during the Vietnamese boat people crisis, and he had by then moved to the Reader's Digest in Bombay, and with that second heart attack. I was finally sort of, in a position to afford to take him abroad for treatment. So I took him to the famous Cleveland Clinic in America, and they discovered that he'd actually been carrying a huge aneurysm from the first heart attack. So the fear that when you get your first heart attack that young, that you might not have much longer to live, that fear is always there. On top of which, there was a family tendency amongst his brothers. His elder brother had multiple heart attacks. His youngest brother died at 36 of a heart attack. And so all of this gave us every reason to be extremely worried.
As you say,
and I sort of was conscious of that worry all the time.
You say you adored your father, you said you worshipped him, and from the age of 12, you lived with this terrible fear that someday something might happen. That phone call could be the bad news coming to me.
That's right.
When he died, you say in your essay you blamed yourself because you had begun to accept in your heart the possibility he would pass away. You write, I felt that in recent months I had not tried hard enough to keep him alive. Into my mind I had admitted the possibility that he would go. My need of him, my need for his approval, his support, his help had been diluted over time, while his need of my need had never changed. I had ceased to need him as much as before. I had allowed the urgency of our bonds to slacken, and now they have snapped for all time. That's heart-wrenching.
Thank you, Karan. Well, it was very, very painful to live through as well as to write. My father, because I was already living and working abroad, my father was a physically distant presence anyway. And those were not the days of free WhatsApp phone calls. I mean, it cost a fortune to make a call. And so we wrote letters to each other, which in some ways, of course, is very precious because then you have something more you can hold on to from those. But at the same time, he was helping me long distance. I mean, he would help research for my writings on India. Even though I was abroad, I'd be getting literally filefuls of clippings.
But
of
can
what
you
was
explain
going on,
something?
that sort of thing. So that he knew that I needed his support and his help that way.
But it's the point that really struck me as I read that paragraph is that you felt responsible for his death, guilty almost, because you'd begun to accept in your heart and your mind that he would die one day. Why do you think, or why did you think at that time you were guilty?
It's difficult to explain. I mean, I often felt that it was that one is kept alive by the intensity of the need for one to be alive, by those who are dependent on one, by those who love you, who care for you, whose love sustains you. And I think it was that I was referring to, that somehow I reached a point where I think I had begun to make it obvious to Dad that I didn't need him. That I was my own man, I had my own career, my own life, my own books, my own identity, whatever. I was living in a different country, far away. There was not much more that he could do for me, sort of thing. And it's a sad feeling that I felt that somehow in my own system, in my own sense of being, I wasn't conveying that. It's a stupid, vain thing to think when you think I have two younger sisters who loved him as much and who were also very, very anxious to see him healthy and well. Indeed, his last year he spent time with all three of us, as it turned out. One in London, one in California, one, in my case at that point, in Geneva. And I have to say that it's probably almost foolish to say what I said then, but I said it because I felt it.
Yep, you felt that your love for him was what was keeping him alive. But as time
not just my love, my need for him as well.
But as time, distance, and age made you an independent person, that need diminished, and in a sense you felt that had lessened his life for him.
Yeah.
It's almost 30 years since your father died. When you think of him today, what's the memory that comes to mind?
All of these things. I mean, he was such an extraordinarily larger than life figure in our lives. My sisters and I constantly.
But is there one single memory that comes to mind?
No, Karan. There never is just one. There must be dozens at different times, different moments. My mother, who's now 85, was constantly saying, "Oh, I wish Daddy were here to see this, or enjoy this, or watch this." Or there are many things. Literally on a day-to-day basis, which he never saw, or which he was not able to be part of. And I think, how much he had a zest for life, by the way, which was truly remarkable. My younger sister is the one who's got that more than I can lay claim to. She's very much like him in her desire to sort of grab life by the scruff of the neck.
You remember him clearly. When you think of him, his face is clear in your mind.
Oh, yes, very much so. Though again, that also gets influenced by the photographs, which are all you've got left. And so you look at the photograph, and at some point the photograph becomes the memory, which is, again, true of all of us, but is not ever enough.
I'll turn to your mother in a moment's time, but as I read that essay on your father, it revealed something of you to me. I suddenly began to say to myself, Shashi is soft-hearted, he's sentimental, he's emotional. Is that the real Shashi Tharoor?
That's entirely from my father as well. He was more sentimental, more soft-hearted than I am, but I think I've inherited some of that leaning. Yes.
So behind the bluster of that verbiage that you throw at us and behind the clipped British accent, actually, Shashi is a softie.
Shashi is a softie, yes. Don't reveal that to the world, Karan.
Let's
As it is, I have too many people making too many demands I never say no to. So.
But you are a softie. Let's come to your mother. The relationship with your mother is very different to the relationship you had with your father. You write, my mother and I have not always had the easiest of relationships. She has always been a difficult person, in contrast to my affable father, who was generous to a fault and always anxious to please others. My mother isn't. She is a direct, no-nonsense woman who is blunt to the point of rudeness. That's incredibly, if not bluntly, candid. But was it easy to write that about your mother?
Yeah, I have to confess, that particular piece was written a few years ago, and my mother's even mellowed since then. So she is, it's probably unfair now that I put that in without emendation, because she has now become much mellower. But she was certainly, I mean, she was certainly very blunt, direct, no-nonsense kind of person. Incredibly self-reliant and proud of her self-reliance. I mean, until 82, she was driving her own car.
Tell me this, though. Is it easy to have written so bluntly, so critically of your own mum? Was it difficult for you? Did the pen waver in your hand?
I didn't think it was critical. I thought it was honest, which is not the same thing. I mean, my mother and I actually have the best relationship now that we've ever had all our lives. And we're very, very fond of and close to each other. And I cherish that. I feel in many ways that the circumstances that have allowed this to happen. For example, until COVID came along, my mother would never have lived with me full time. She came for a month or two at a time and went back to her flat in Kerala. But she got stuck here with COVID and spent the best part of a year with me, and now another year, and we've realized this is the permanent arrangement. She's going to be based here, and or based wherever I am, and this is something which has obviously transformed a lot of things between us. I mean,
absolutely. That's what your book points out, that the young Shashi and the middle-aged Shashi had a very difficult relationship with his father. The closeness you have today did not exist earlier. And you compare it to your father and point out that there was an affability, an adoration, a sense of worship. For him, your attitude to your mother was different.
Well, my mother was a tough cookie. I think in most couples, one is tougher than the other. And perhaps the softness of the one drives the other into greater toughness.
Mummy was the bad cop.
Mummy was the bad cop and Daddy was a good cop. Mummy also was driven somehow in turn. I think it's partial. They both grew up in villages. Dad then went to college in Palghar town. They went to college in the UK. My mum never did. She finished high school and that was it. And was married off at the tender age of 18. And I think she felt in many ways that her children might be the vehicles to fulfill the various things that she never really had a chance to fulfill.
So she was deliberately tough with you.
So I think but her expectations were always the highest.
In fact,
she was never ever satisfied with anything I ever accomplished.
In fact,
and all of that. That's what created, I think, some of that.
I get the clear impression from that essay on your mum that one of the problems was she didn't praise you. You write, and I'm quoting you, "Nothing I ever did was good enough for my mother. I came first in class every year but one, but she never congratulated me. I don't remember her congratulating me when I obtained the highest possible marks in India in my school leaving examination and received a gold medal from the West Bengal government." You were clearly yearning for Mummy's praise and approval.
Yeah, I'm afraid so. Karan, you're psychoanalyzing me in ways that I find deplorable. But yes, I suppose I was yearning for approval that never quite came. But you know, that's children and their parents for you. What can I say?
Mummy was perhaps making up for the fact that approval came far too readily from Daddy. Daddy adored Shashi, and she was going to be the tough one to make sure that Shashi wasn't spoiled.
Yeah, and didn't stop trying. So the entire thing, I think I realized with her, is that constant restless discontent was about keeping on doing better than you have done before. Never rest on your laurels. And with her, I wasn't allowed to rest on my laurels.
But there's something else. This particular passage is part of an essay that was originally written in 2018 when you, Shashi, was 62. Did it still rankle with you at that age?
I think the occasion was, if I'm not mistaken, my mother's 80th. So it might have been, if it was 2000, I can't remember the exact, if it was
2018, take my word for it. And I believe it originally appeared in Outlook.
Either Outlook or The Week, one of those weekly magazines. Anyway, I will have to look back and say
But did it rankle with you still at the age of 62?
Rankle is too strong a word. I mean, I honestly didn't feel any particular resentments. I did feel that it was not nice to constantly be made to feel wanting. But at the same time...
What a wonderful way of putting it. Not nice to be constantly made to feel wanting. Mummy made you feel wanting.
Well, let's say inadequate or not sufficient. I guess partly what happened was with Mom was that she drove me to constantly feel the need to prove myself. And that, in the end...
was the making of you.
It could well have been the making of me.
Except that it doesn't reflect in your essay. The rankling does, not the making of you.
So there should be a revised edition with that additional point.
She's also a very independent person, isn't she? You write, and I'm quoting you again, self-reliance is my mother's mantra. She doesn't like being dependent on others' help. She stubbornly refuses to hire full-time domestic help. She cooks, cleans, entertains guests with endless cups of tea and nibblies. Now that's an admirable quality, but I didn't detect too much admiration in the essay.
Well, I just thought that by the time I was writing this and she'd crossed 80, that she really ought to give herself a break. And it was frustrating for all of us that she was doing this, because she also, we felt, would be better served by professional help around the kitchen and the living room and so on. In any case, now that she has finally settled down with me and gets all the support, I think she's beginning to realize that she has earned a bit of a rest.
Now, there's something else about your mother. You make it quite clear that she didn't approve of your becoming a politician. She disapproved of my entering politics and praised regularly that I quit and return to what she sees as respectability. I quite like the last part, by the way. But why is she so dismissive of politics?
I think for the wrong reasons, frankly. I think she felt that sort of quote unquote the wrong sorts of people are the ones who go into politics.
To many, that sounds like the right reason, by the way.
There's this kind of odd cleavage, isn't there, Karan? I'll be very honest. I mean, I was a reasonably popular kid in school and college, and I won the college presidency and so on and so forth. But there would have been horror at home if I had tried to translate that into a political career, because the sort of urban educated middle class tends to think that if you can pass exams, you write them. You go on to the next hurdle, take the IAS exam or the IPS exam or the Foreign Service exam or whatever, and make a career. It's the fellows who can't pass the exams who will go into politics. That sort of attitude is there, and I think it's really out of date. There are lots of very fine politicians.
But don't talk against your mother's view. Explain your mother's view instead of talking
I'm
against
just saying
it.
my mother's still anchored in that old sort of 1960s, early 70s view of the cleavage between those who are qualified to pass exams and those who are unqualified and go into politics, because a lot of highly qualified people are in politics today.
Let's be honest.
So her view is out of date.
No, let's be honest. Your mum thinks politicians are wastrels, that they're scoundrels.
Look, I'm not going to put words into her mouth myself. I wouldn't let you put words into her mouth.
But she doesn't think very highly of them, does she?
She doesn't think very highly.
Writing of both your mum and dad, you say, I had grown up thinking of my father as a life-affirming source of love and laughter, and my mother as a frequently critical, temperamental Harridan given to moody outbursts.
Now, there I'm being critical of myself.
But the point is, you thought of your mother
I was wrong
as
to
a
think of her
temperamental Harridan given to moody outbursts. Clearly, the young Tharoor preferred daddy to mummy.
I think that's fair to say, and my mother's sort of said that to me as much, so I'm not acknowledging anything wrong. But
Did it hurt her?
Yes, of course it must have, and I'm being critical of myself for having felt that way.
And you knew at the time that the preference for daddy was hurting mummy?
I probably didn't know it very consciously.
Or admit it to yourself?
Or admit it to myself. And it's really only after losing Dad and coming to terms with a relationship with one parent that a lot of these things become more apparent.
Let me ask you this. Did you really mean to think of your mother or describe her as a Harridan? The word derives from 17th century French slang, and it means a bad-tempered old woman. It's not the nicest way of thinking of mummy.
Well, if you're a teenager, then a woman in her late 30s strikes you as an old woman. So, I mean, that's all it was. But the bad temper, yeah, my mum would let fly a lot, and that's what I was referring to. But what I lacked at the time that I thought that way was the ability to see beyond the superficial thing of being bawled at, as it were, to the larger issues of what was driving her to do that. And that is, I think, where...
But the young Shashi did think of mummy as a Harridan.
I'm afraid that's true, or I wouldn't have written it, yeah.
Today, of course, the relationship with a mother is very different. You write, I'm lucky to have a mother who sets such an amazing example. How would you describe the relationship today?
Oh, today it's one. First of all, I can see a lot of her positive qualities much more clearly, because the other qualities that I objected to while growing up have long since mellowed and faded.
It's also perhaps because you've grown up too.
And perhaps because I've grown up too. Secondly, my own sisters have played a big role in helping me understand that a lot of qualities of mine are actually not, as I've always fondly and vainly imagined, sort of directly from my father, but in many ways are my mother's. And so I've begun to feel a greater affinity, as it were, for her influence upon me, which for much of my young years I denied to myself and to others. So I think there's a much greater acceptance and respect on my part for her. She's really pulled through some pretty heavy odds to be the person she is. She's also done an amazing amount to encourage all our talents, such as they were. And that's something we took for granted too much as children. She herself had multiple talents, but never had the staying power with them. She had singing talent, but never really trained systematically. When we were in Calcutta, she sort of mastered Rabindra Sangeet well enough to sing on a couple of stages, dropped it. She did Tanjore glass painting, did a couple of lovely pieces, one of which still hangs in my house in Delhi, dropped it. My mother she was kind of all over the place, but never sustained herself.
Was that something you held against her?
No, I think we wanted to see her fulfilled. I mean, I think in all fairness, all of us wanted. So the fact that she was constantly doing something, giving it up because she was discontented with it and wanted to do something else, that kind of thing we felt was unfortunate for her. It would be nice if she had found one niche and remained with it.
But in a sense, when you felt like that, you were imposing your thinking on her.
Of course I was. And the one thing actually she did consistently for very many years, and I think I didn't even give enough credit to her for that, and I wish I had mentioned in the book, is she actually read to the blind at her own time, free of charge, at the Braille
Institute. You don't mention that in the essay at all?
I don't, and I should have. And she read to the blind right from her 30s into her 70s. For the longest time in different cities where she lived.
So can I put it like this? At 65, Shashi has realized that his mother has qualities he wasn't aware of or wasn't admitting to himself. And now, the mummy that was so forbidding for the younger, perhaps I would say immature Shashi, is suddenly a much more loving parent.
Oh, absolutely. Not just loving, a very admirable parent. I admire my mother now in ways that I think when I was younger I didn't realize.
Admiration doesn't show in that essay at all. It does now feel real to you.
Yes, absolutely. And I think I will update that essay because of the incredibly good quality time we've spent together in the last couple of years, which COVID made possible. So this is a pre-COVID essay that needs updating, and I regret that in the haste to bung pieces into the book, I didn't give myself the chance to rewrite it. I will.
My last question. I'm glad to hear you say you regret not rewriting it, but there will be several who will read that essay, and perhaps that word Harridan in particular, and say, he's being a bit disrespectful, or he's being unfilial. Does it worry you that perhaps how you wrote it may not necessarily be how it will be read? You were being honest, but it might be read as criticism.
I think obviously I'll deserve any criticism I get for that. But at the same time, it was meant to be written with honesty. It was meant to be a work of a son looking back on a difficult relationship with his mother. And perhaps, the part of the problem with authorial honesty is it doesn't go over so very well if you're also somebody in the public sphere and are seen in a different way.
Absolutely. But you have been not just honest, you've been transparent. And as I said in the introduction, there are moments when you read the essay on your father and it's heart-wrenching. And there are moments when you read the essay on your mother and it's surprising because the candor is blunt. But it's admirable always. I shouldn't be saying that to your face, but it is admirable to be so honest. Thank you, Shashi.
We've talked about 2 essays out of, 75 in the book. But these 2 obviously are the most personal and most intensely personal of them all.
And
now
these
we have
are 2
established
essays.
at the end of this that
These are 2 essays that very few other politicians would have written, because I don't think politicians find it easy to write about their parents, and certainly not with such candor. Thank you very much indeed, Shashi. Take care, stay safe, and my love to your mummy.
I'll convey it. Thank you.